but I am very, very excited to be able to talk to everyone today about this topic that emerged from data that we did with faculty at a research-intensive university. And I'm going to talk to you today about this phenomenon of epistemic exclusion. Theorists have posited that systems of oppression will combine with stereotypes and negative images of different social groups, and that will produce a set of people that become the acceptable bodies of knowers, and then those that are deemed outside of that body of knowers. And the people that become the knowers are then in a position to reify knowledge, to decide what is legitimate for knowledge, which things are outside of the realm of a particular discipline, and then who can be the bodies that produce that knowledge. So if we're talking about patriarchy, then women are stereotyped in negative ways, and that allows men to be defined as the true knowers. If we talk about racism, then that will combine with stereotypes about people of color, and will assume that they are incompetent, and then assert that white people are the right bodies of people to be knowers. And one consequence of these forces of knowledge oppression is what we've come to call epistemic exclusion. And epistemic exclusion involves devaluing or dismissing knowledge that's outside of the dominant discourse of a field. And in an academic context, this could mean that certain topics of scholarship, particularly things around race, gender, sexual orientation, social class, that those are deemed outside the norm of what's acceptable in a discipline. And a key feature of epistemic exclusion is that it also involves devaluing and dismissing the knowledge that's produced by marginalized group members. And because of their situatedness, or because of their social position, those marginalized group members have a very different lived experience from dominant group members, and this ends up further putting them on the margins. Epistemic exclusion, I often call it EE, you'll hear me say. EE can indeed happen intentionally. There can be someone who is deliberately bigoted or biased and decides they don't like these kinds of people, and they'll say such. But I think that what's much more insidious is when the ways it shows up unconsciously or subconsciously. Here, someone might have implicit biases, and rather than say, I don't like those kinds of people, they might come up with very sophisticated reasons for why they don't like certain bodies of research, and why certain bodies of research are not sophisticated enough to warrant inclusion in the field. And that becomes a way of no longer owning that they're also claiming that about the groups of people that actually do that work. So they can make the argument that research is not sophisticated enough for our field, and if people of color just happen to do more of that research, it's merely coincidence, it's not my bigotry. And so people with power are in a position to reject other individuals and reject other types of research and define what's going to be acceptable. They're able to establish and maintain disciplinary norms. And because excluding these other types of research and these other types of researchers is actually feeding into systems within the academy that have made them successful, they have zero incentive to begin to question the way they're doing science. As a result, the system continues to privilege the privileged. So to provide you with a little bit of context of what does academia look like, although I'm imagining everybody in this room knows, this is data from NSF in 2013, and it's showing the proportion of faculty from each of these various ethnic groups. And what jumps out at us is the proportion of faculty members that are white. What I'll tell you, though, is that this data is all faculty. So it's including adjunct faculty, it's including lecturers, which we already know disproportionately is embodied by people of color. If we look at research-intensive universities, which is very difficult to isolate that kind of data, these numbers are far more skewed. So what we have here, faculty of color have low representation, making them tokens within the academy. This is then combined with belonging to low social status groups. And these social status groups, most of which are also negatively stereotyped with regard to intelligence and knowledge production. So this makes them especially vulnerable to being cast outside of the norm of knowers within their institutions and within their departments. Furthermore, Faculty of color are far more likely to study topics that cast them further on the fringe of the field by centering experiences of those that are marginalized and oppressed, and using non-traditional methodology and research methods. All of these cast them further from their disciplinary norms and expectations. So given the theories, given the literature, we conducted a large-scale study of faculty of color at a research-intensive university. And this study is far bigger than what I could actually cover if you gave me even several hours. But we have 118 faculty of color at a research institution doing one-on-one qualitative interviews that lasted from anywhere an hour to 2 hours. This literally is almost 2,000 single-space pages and 10.5 of data. I have a career for the rest of my life. And so I'm going to present to you only a tiny piece that's specific to epistemic exclusion, but there's far more that we'll be discussing. And actually, as was mentioned earlier, one of our articles is now available online at JBB, and I can talk to you about it later. So our questions: do faculty of color experience epistemic exclusion? How does epistemic exclusion manifest in academic spaces? And I'll briefly touch on how is it that faculty are coping with these kinds of experiences. So I've already talked to you a little bit about the method, but to give you a sense of our sample here, you can see it's pretty well balanced across factors like gender, nativity, language of origin, rank, race, STEM and non-STEM fields, and many of the social sciences like psychology are included in STEM as well. So this represents the people in the room. We did a thematic analysis from the data. This is important because it allows us to look at themes and discover themes that we might not have known were there, which is exactly what ended up happening with epistemic exclusion. This was not something we were looking for, but it's something that popped out frequently. To give you a brief overview of the other 2,000 pages of data, we found indeed that faculty did experience bias. 62% of the faculty talked about experiencing bias directly. They had their own individual personal stories of bias. 74% also talked about experiences that they had directly witnessed happening to others, or that they had heard about from the target or from somebody that witnessed the events. And 23% of the faculty talked about these strange body of experiences that reflected bias, but it seemed to specifically be focused on their research. Now I want to remind you, these were open-ended questions. We were not probing for questions about bias related to their research, so we can't take that to mean that only 23% of the population actually has this experience. All it means is that a quarter of the population spontaneously decided to mention this in these interviews. So bias based on research. In essence, we were observing epistemic exclusion without even knowing that that term existed at the time. Because to date, theories of epistemic exclusion have not been addressed in the field of psychology and have not been empirically examined. But we found that epistemic exclusion operated both formally through the valuing of certain types of scholarship, as well as the metrics that were put in place to evaluate scholarship quality. And we also found that it was functioning informally, and the kinds of messages communicated about what scholarship should be, who's being recognized and valued for that scholarship, which things are appreciated and recognized, and whose milestones were rewarded. So let's first talk about the formal ways, the formal hierarchies that constructed epistemic exclusion. Most often, faculty were spontaneously talking about the ways their scholarship was perceived as lacking in quality or value. Sometimes this was a general discussion of a lack of valuation, as illustrated by the quote here. My unit tends to be very traditional in how they conceptualize what academia is and what scholarship is. Very traditional in terms of fields. Like most of my colleagues don't recognize what I do. They just don't. That's why I'm in another department. In the other department, I'm sorry, I edited here, I'm reading you how they actually spoke, the difficulties they were having. My home department basically doesn't care, and they don't care about what I study. So it's taken me a while to maybe not to transition, but to come to terms with the fact that they will never be interested in what I do. They will never be interested in what I do. This participant's quote highlights a strategy that some of the participants were using to deal with epistemic exclusion, and that was looking for other places where they could be valued. This might be other spaces within an institution, like seeking out another department alliance. It could be the particular committees that they chose to participate within the institution. But far too often, it also included having to go outside of their institution altogether. Sometimes that's through societies such as this one here. Others, it was beginning to actually look for employment elsewhere. And sometimes the devaluation of their scholarship was directly related to comments about the quality. This might be related to methodology used. I don't feel valued in the department. I don't think people understand the kind of research I do. I don't think it's viewed as research because of the type of methodology I use. It's a very highly quantitatively inclined department. And other times, it was also because they were conducting research in a non-traditional context, such as international work. When I was hired, I made it very clear that international work is what I do. And I've never deceived anybody about the fact that I was going to continue doing international work. But within my department and within my own academic program, there was very little support